Thank you, Commissioners. Bob Weeks, 2451 Regency Lakes Court in Wichita. One question I had is, I read some of these applications that were made available to us, and I'd just be interested in learning if we know what the cost of preparing all these applications was, and going forward, what's going to be the cost of compliance with the terms of these grants. And speaking of, like John Todd did of Mike Pompeo, he believes that the cost of complying oftentimes with these grants is substantial compared to the amount of money that we're receiving. But with regard to the wisdom of this particular grant, Milton Friedman said, "Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program." So is that true, or is that just rhetoric and speculation by the brilliant and freedom-loving economist? And if we ask the question, do federal grants cause state and or local tax increases in the future after the government grant ends, we now have an answer based not on theory or speculation or conjecture, but on actual research, because economists have examined the evidence and they find the answer is yes. It's Russell Sobel and George Crowley, and their paper is titled, "Do Intergovernmental Grants Create Ratchets in State and Local Taxes?" The difference between this research and most is that these authors look at the impact of federal grants on state and local tax policy in future periods, not just the present period that concerns us today. This is important because, in their words, federal grants often result in states creating new programs and hiring new employees, and when the federal funding for that specific purpose is discontinued, these new state programs must either be discontinued or financed through increases in state-owned source taxes. And these remarks also apply, as they say, to local governments like counties and cities. They also say, far from always being an unintended consequence, some federal grants are made with the intention that states will pick up funding the program in the future. Now, I know that some of the proposed expenditures for this grant are one-time purchase of equipment, but there is a plan to hire a toxicologist to support what is described in the application as timely investigation of criminal activity. So what will happen when these grant funds expire? Will we be unwilling to go back to the untimely investigation of criminal activity if in fact that describes our present situation? And if that does not describe our present situation, then why do we need this grant? There's much more in the conclusions to the research paper. It's very interesting, but it's research. Now, we realize that some have criticized arguments that I and others have made as being only theoretical, and that as commissioners, you must deal with the real world. But what I have presented today is not just a quaint theory. It is empirical research, meaning it's looking at what has actually happened, and that does, in fact, describe the real world. So not only are we taxed to pay for the cost of funding federal and state grants, the units of government that receive grants are very likely to raise their own levels of taxation in response to the receipt of the grants. This creates a cycle of ever-expanding government that needs to end, and it needs to end right now. We only need to look at the turmoil in Washington right now to understand that our spending at all levels of government is simply out of control. I believe, gentlemen, that we can do better. Now, while most people think of the problem of government overspending requiring a top-down solution that starts in Washington, we have to do better than waiting for Washington to ask. So right here, right now in Sedgwick County, home to what the Weather Channel calls the fourth hottest city in the country, we can show the rest of the country a way. We can show the country that there is a bottom-up solution to the problem of federal expending, and that is why I would urge you to reject the acceptance of this grant today. And thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I have printed remarks for the clerk, if that's helpful.
Okay. We have a comment from Commissioner Peterjohn.
Mr. Weeks,
yes.
Question I've got for you is the fact that this amount that we're seeking for a grant this year significantly below what we had last year or previous years, and I think we've had these grants for a number of years before this. Factor it all into this issue in any way, shape, or form, in your opinion?
Not for me. I don't know about for anybody else.
Okay. Let me ask you this. My understanding is we were in competition to seek this grant. If we don't turn it down, it'll just go to some other community and get spent there. I've sometimes voted in support of grants. I've sometimes voted against some of the grants. If some other community is going to spend it, why wouldn't you say, gee, you're just cutting off your nose to spite your face, because this money's going to get spent somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a very compelling argument, and I think that's why very often these grants are very rarely turned down, and that's why local governments like cities and counties compete for them. But Commissioner Peterjohn, to my mind, this just buys into a self-perpetuating system that will never end. And I think that if we had the courage and gumption or whatever to do this here in Sedgwick County, that it could set an example. And federal officials and office holders and congressmen, I think Congress, at least the House, is on the verge of actually doing something historic, perhaps, with controlling the future trajectory of spending in our country. But, they need our support, too. And I think that this is a way that we can show that.
Well, I agree with you that there's a need for Washington to change the way they operate, and I've, in my own way, in my own time, tried to take some steps in that direction. But I think turning down this grant today, I have a hard time seeing that, because a lot of the items that were detailed today are, like you acknowledged, basically one-time purchase of equipment and machinery, or items for the operation, and since someone else is going to get the chance to spend it, I'm really looking for a compelling argument on top of presentation from you and Mr. Todd and Ms. Cohen, who are all I consider friends of mine, and want to understand in terms of why at this point, because frankly I think there have been grants that I voted against that were much more egregious in the time I've been up here, and than the one we have before us today.
Well, I certainly sympathize with your position that, this money will be spent elsewhere in other cities if we don't apply for it. So, yeah, it's a very tough decision, I think, if you were to vote against this. But nonetheless, I would encourage you to consider that, simply because someone's got to start doing something somewhere.
Thank you, Commissioner. Do you have a question for the speaker?
Does the manager have input on, are we in competition?
No. If we don't accept it, the money will just go to the city of Wichita. It's not other communities. It's the city of Wichita.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Weeks.
I got a question.
Commissioner Skelton.
Hey, Bob, tell me. You said we should set an example by refusing this grant.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of example are we going to set?
Well, I think we would set an example, as I said, that there can be a bottom-up approach to the problem of overspending.
But don't you think that, we would be certainly putting ourselves at a disadvantage here relative to other parts of the United States?
Hopefully it would be a short-lived disadvantage that I think that we in here, with the aid of perhaps our federal representatives, could start a trend, start something that could put an end to this at the national level.
Well, I appreciate you, and I do agree with you. I do, and I agree with Carl there in his position today as a commissioner, a fellow commissioner. What I got to say is, we got to probably look at the tax code. The whole United States government needs to be revamped. I mean, the system that we've had has existed for over 200 years, and redistribution of wealth has always been a game of the feds. And sometimes I agree with it in the help of some people who cannot help themselves, who are poor, and sometimes I don't agree with it, and examples I'll skip. But if we're sending our resources up there, I mean, my position is that, we know we're going to be getting some of them back, and it's a tough deal, especially when, as Commissioner Peterjohn says, that if we refuse this, it's really not changing anything at the federal level, which I think is a prerequisite to this whole thing. It's just going to be setting ourselves at a disadvantage.
Well, I appreciate that. I would just say that we've not always had an income tax in this country. That's a relative recent innovation, and somehow we managed to thrive in the years before that. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.